Welcome back to our video series on the book of Daniel. Chapter 7 of Daniel has been divided into two parts. This is the second part, which covers the little horn. In our video on the four beasts, we ended with Daniel seeing a little horn come up among the 10 horns and do 6 very important things. It came up among the 10 horns. Number 2, it uproots 3 of the 10 horns. 3, it spoke boastfully against the Most High. 4, it wages war against the saints and oppresses them. 5, it attempts to change set times and laws. 6, it rules for a time, times, and half a time. This little horn disturbed Daniel and deeply troubled him. His face turned pale when he saw all the trouble that would come upon his people. Even though Daniel was troubled, God gave this vision so you and I would not be troubled. As we look around the world today, God wants us to know that He has foreseen and forewarned us. He knows the forces of evil that are out there. Because He knows, all we need to do is stay close to Jesus, and He will protect us and guide us through. So let's identify this little horn and all the evil it has done and will do. The first point. It came up among the horns, or kingdoms, that were arising at the time imperial Rome was breaking apart. Let us go back into history to see what entity was arising among all the nations of Europe during the time imperial Rome was breaking up. As Jesus was leaving this earth, He commanded His disciples to go into all the world and make disciples of everyone. By the middle of the first century, missionaries were taking the gospel among the peoples of Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, Greece, and Italy. As Jesus said in Matthew 28:20, "Teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you." This was not a new religion, but simply a rediscovering of the old religion that had been hidden and covered over with man-made rules, ceremonies, and customs by the Jews. As John told us in 1 John 2:7, "Dear friends, I am not writing to you a new commandment, but an old commandment that you have had from the beginning. This old commandment is the word you have heard." Ever since Genesis, the world has been hearing and receiving the same command from Jesus, to love by obedience to the 10 Commandments. The first persecution of those who were bringing back the ancient truths of the Bible were from the Jews. In AD 34, the Jewish nation could no longer tolerate the growth and teachings of this old-fashioned teaching of the Christians. They dragged Stephen before the council and then stoned him. Persecution broke out, and the early Christian church fled. Using those wonderful roads that Rome had built, they could travel quickly as far away as England to the north, India to the east, and Egypt to the south. God had provided this network of roads for their escape. God always provides for His children. As long as Christianity was a local, isolated sect, the pagan world did not care. But when the Jews persecuted the Christians, and the Christians fled, the Christians took up housekeeping all over the Roman Empire. Now we begin to see a problem. The pagans kept the first day of the week holy in honor of the sun god. The Christians kept God's day, Sabbath, the 7th day holy. Now these Christians were in every nation and neighborhood of the pagan empire. Since the Christians refused to recognize the divinity of the Roman emperor, or pay homage to any god except their own, they were subjected to a number of persecutions by the Roman authorities. The most savage of these was instigated by Diocletian between 303 and 313. You see the beginnings of this conflict recorded in Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 41. It goes something like this. Demetrius was a silversmith who had a very good living making and selling images of the goddess Artemis. He was wealthy and may have owned a large house with indoor plumbing and a pool. He also may have owned a 4-horsepowered, 4-door convertible chariot. It may have been snazzy with iron wheels and leather interior. It could have been that one day the creditor came by to repossess his chariot. I am sure Demetrius would have been upset. He may have called his accountant and may have wanted to know why the bills hadn't been paid. The accountant may have told him that business had not been very good and the income had fallen. Demetrius would not have understood this. He may have started looking around to see why his images were not selling. It probably didn't take him long to discover the reason. More and more of his neighbors were becoming Christian. As each became Christian, they stopped buying his idols. This was intolerable. He was going to go broke if this Christian belief was not stopped. He may have called together the men in the related trades and told them what was happening. They may have agreed with him. They probably had seen their own incomes drop. How were they going to keep their expensive chariots without their idols selling? They instigated an uproar and a riot ensued. All this because their income was being disrupted by some Christians. But it didn't end there. You see, not only did the Christians refuse to buy the idols, they refused to go to the state-sponsored temples of the pagans and meet on Sunday, the day of worship for the pagan sun god. They stayed home on the seventh day, the Sabbath, and rested in obedience to the fourth commandment. By not going to the pagan temples, Caesar, who was the vicar of the sun god, was losing out on his share of the money that pagans brought to the temples. Fewer and fewer people were going to the pagan temples. How was Caesar going to support his wars, temples, and opulent lifestyle? He couldn't sit by and let this happen. Persecution broke out against the Christians. As the Christians were persecuted in one place, they fled to another. Soon the Christians were in every part of the Roman Empire, from England to India to Egypt. There was no place in the Roman Empire you couldn't find a Christian. Christianity was coming up among the nations. But as Christianity grew, it lost its Christian nature. It became a bureaucracy that was sponsored by the state. How? Again, history provides the answer. Rome was spending a lot of money defending its borders against the Germanic tribes of the north, the Asians of the east, and the Egyptians of the south. It could not do it all. On top of all that, it was involved in an internal war with the Christians. It could not support all these war efforts. Something had to give. The western half of the Imperial Roman Empire gradually disintegrated and was replaced by a collection of kingdoms or nations ruled by various Germanic peoples. The Goths occupied Italy and Spain. The Franks established themselves in Gaul, and Britain was conquered by the Anglo-Saxons. The Emperor Constantine, before 312, seemed to have been a tolerant pagan, willing to accumulate heavenly patrons, but not committed to any one deity. Between 312 and 324, however, he gradually adopted the Christian God as his protector, and on several occasions granted special privileges to individual churches and bishops. Soon after his victory over Licinius on September 18, 324, Constantine openly embraced Christianity. Since Rome was the capital of the world, and all the world looked to Rome, it was only natural that by the 3rd century the Roman bishops were representing themselves as deserving supreme authority in doctrinal matters. In the Edict of Milan in 313, the Roman Empire, Constantine, granted toleration to Christianity. Christianity began to rise to the status of an official religion. A series of popes, most notably Leo I, translated that claim into a primacy of jurisdiction over the whole Christian church. It was during the 5th century AD that the civil government of Rome entered a decline, and Rome was sacked in 410 by the Visigoths under Alaric I and by the Vandals in 455. With the waning of temporal, political, and social authority in the city of Rome, the people began looking to the Pope, or Bishop of Rome, for authority in spiritual and civil matters. Soon the Pope was taking religious and civil matters that belonged to Rome and began expanding that authority over all Western churches. The Christian community in Rome grew to be a powerful force in the Roman Empire. It became head of all the Christian churches within the empire. So while the imperial Roman Empire was falling apart and 10 horns, or 10 nations, were arising out of the breakup of imperial Rome, the spiritual Roman power of the church was rising to replace the civil power of the imperial Roman Empire that was collapsing. But there were some Christian communities that were not bowing to the claims and doctrines of the Bishop of Rome. 3 nations refused to accept all the claims of the Pope of Rome. They were the Vandals of North Africa, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. Let us remember the second point. This little horn came up among the 10 horns or kingdoms of a fallen and broken Roman Empire, and it would destroy or uproot 3 of the horns. Listen carefully to the history. This Bishop of Rome could not allow this divide in the church. War broke out between the Roman Church and the Vandals of North Africa, the Heruli, and the Ostrogoths. In order to destroy the Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Heruli, the Bishop of Rome asked Justinian, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, to send troops and wipe them out. That he complied to do. Keep in mind, it was Justinian's aim to restore the full Roman Empire by reconquest of areas lost to the Germanic tribes and bring the whole Roman Empire under his control. With the help of his general Belisarius, he regained North Africa from the Vandals in 533 to 534, and after a lengthy war from 535 to 554, Italy from the Ostrogoths. With the end of the threats to the Roman bishop's ideology, the Bishop of Rome could now actively be in control of all the Christian churches. The date we set for this is 538 AD. That is the date the last of the 3 nations, the Ostrogoths, were driven from Rome. The Catholic, which means universal, was becoming very powerful. Unlike the humble Jesus it was supposed to represent, it asserted itself in the world as a dominant force. It was picking up the power left by the fall of the Roman Empire. Now we can see where this little horn is the Catholic Church. It has, so far, met 2 of the 6 conditions for being the little horn. Only 4 conditions are left. Let's look at the 3rd condition. It spoke boastfully against the Most High. How does the Catholic Church do this? Since it claims to be a Christian organization, how can it speak against the Most High? It does this in several ways. 1. It claims to have the power to forgive sins. It even sold indulgences. For those of you unfamiliar with indulgences, in the Roman Catholic Church, an indulgence is the remission of the punishment that remains due for sin after sacramental absolution. The Bible plainly states that God alone can forgive sin. That is why the Pharisees were so angered by Jesus' statement that he could forgive sin. After all, Jesus was God. But the Pope, he is not God. Yet he claims to have that power. 2. The Pope also claims to be God on earth. Remember, the popes claim to receive their authority from the line of Peter. Here is what Pope Gregory said in 729 AD. The whole West has its eyes on us. It relies on us and on St. Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, whom all the kingdoms of the West honor as if he were God himself on earth. Point 3. The Pope claims to be infallible. Roman Catholics believe that the Pope can make infallible definitions on faith or morals when he speaks as head of the Church. Papal infallibility was formally defined at the First Vatican Council in 1870. The doctrine was reaffirmed at the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965, which also stressed that the entire body of bishops, in union with the Pope, teach infallibility when all concur in a single viewpoint on matters of faith and morals. By taking the eyes off of God and Jesus Christ, who is our high priest in heaven, it claims the power of God. The Catholic Church turns the eyes of men away from God to a worldly institution for its salvation. Instead of praying to God for forgiveness, it requires you to pray to its own priest for forgiveness. Anytime a person, church, denomination, or anything stands in the way between you and God, that person becomes anti, which means in place of. It becomes anti-Christ, or in place of Christ. As the Caesars claimed to be the representative of the pagan sun god, so the Catholic Church claims to be the representative of God. Instead of teaching people to seek God on their own, it teaches that you must go through the church. That concept came straight out of the pagan temple worship. The Catholic Church also claims that if you do not belong to the church, you cannot get to heaven. The church claims to have the right to keep you out of heaven by kicking you out of the church if you do not obey the church. The church calls this excommunication. They even did it to a German king, Henry IV, in 1076. And of course, you can see the parallels between the Catholic Church and all churches and denominations of the world today. All the churches, in some form or another, insinuate that you must belong to them or their remnant organization in order to go to heaven. How Catholic. The Catholic Church claims all this authority on 4 texts from the Bible. John 1:42 says, "He led Simon to Jesus. Jesus looked at him intently and said, 'You are Simon, John's son. You will be called Cephas,' which is translated Peter." Nothing in that text says that Peter is to be the head of anything. John 21:15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter told him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus told him, "Feed my lambs." There is nothing in that text to show where Peter is to be head of anything. If anything, feeding is a servant's job out in the pasture, not a pontiff up in some luxurious mansion. And besides, we are all to be feeders of the lambs. Each person who accepts Christianity is to be a lamb feeder. They also use the text in Matthew 16, verse 18, and Luke 22, verse 32. I tell you that you are Peter, and it is on this rock that I will build my congregation, and the powers of hell will not conquer it. But I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. When you have come back, you must strengthen your brothers. The councils of the Catholic Church understand these texts to signify that Christ himself constituted St. Peter as a prince of the apostles and visible head of the church, possessed of a primacy of jurisdiction that was to pass down in perpetuity to his papal successors, along with the authority to pronounce infallibly on matters of faith and morals. The problem with this is that it isn't true. None of the texts above signify that any one entity is to be above another. In fact, the whole teaching of Jesus is to be servants to each other, not masters. Listen to Jesus when the disciples were disputing as to who would be the highest in the kingdom. Matthew 23:11. The person who is greatest among you must be your servant. Mark 10:42 through 43. Jesus called his disciples and told them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers among the Gentiles lord it over them, and their superiors act like tyrants over them. That's not the way it should be among you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." And in John 12:26, "If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there my servant will also be. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." In other words, if Jesus had pointed Peter out to be the head of the church, there would have been no argument as to who would be the head. But that argument continued right up into the Last Supper. That is how we know that Jesus did not designate anyone to be head of his church. Why? Because Jesus said that he is, and he alone is, to be head of the church, and we are to follow him and him alone. In actuality, James is shown as leader of the church after Jesus left this earth. No, my friend, the Catholic Church is not founded on Jesus, but on man. It does not teach the teachings of Jesus, but man. In Matthew 16, Jesus is not pointing or talking about Peter when he says, "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." He is talking about himself. The gates of Hades did overcome Peter when he denied Jesus, but they did not overcome Jesus. The situation in Matthew 16 is much the same as in John 2:19. Here Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." He is not referring to the temple made of stone, but to his body temple. In both instances, if you were standing there, you would have seen Jesus pointing to himself. But the people thought he was referring to the Jerusalem temple, just as he was not referring to Peter as the rock, but to his own body as the rock. If the Catholic Church wants to use this verse as referring to Peter as the rock on which the church is founded, then they must also use the verse found in Matthew 16:23. Here, Jesus is specifically referring to Peter when he says, "Get behind me, Satan! You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." This text would be more in line with the Catholic Church, since it claims to be built on Peter, and Jesus called Peter Satan. So the Catholic Church is built on Satan. It is a stumbling block because it does not obey or teach the teachings of Christ and does not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Even Peter recognized that Jesus and Jesus only is the rock. Peter says in 1 Peter 2:4, "As you come to him, the living stone." He didn't point to himself, he pointed to Jesus. Again, he shows that Jesus is the rock and cornerstone, not Peter. "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone," verse 6. Never does Peter refer to himself as the foundation of the Christian church. Even in the Old Testament, Jesus is called the rock. Jesus will not give his authority to anyone else. The fourth point says that the little horn would wage war against the saints of God. As the Catholic Church grew and became the controlling power of the Holy Roman Empire, it became cruel and wicked. It wanted to destroy any who did not bow down to its authority. During the rule of the Catholic Church, it killed over 75 million people. Let's just take, for an example, the unholy war against the Muslims that is called the Crusade. This was a military expedition undertaken between the 11th and the 14th centuries to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. Nothing holy about that land. The word crusade, which is derived from the Latin crux or cross, is a reference to the biblical injunction that Christians carry their cross in Matthew 10:38. Crusaders wore a red cloth cross sewn on their tunics to indicate that they had assumed the cross and were soldiers of Christ. How sick. We are not to carry a physical cross of any kind. That would be idolatry. We are to carry a spiritual cross, one in which we live as Jesus lived and sacrifice our own lives, not the lives of others. Millions were killed in the Crusades. All in the name of God, men went out to kill each other. What blasphemy! How can men who claim to follow the meek and lowly one go kill others simply because they don't agree with you? Look what is happening now in the Middle East between the Israelites and the Palestinians. All in the name of God. Must not be the right, loving God. Another evil invention of the Catholic Church to destroy those who refused to bow to its satanic system was the Inquisition. This was a medieval church court which was instituted to seek out and prosecute heretics. It went something like this. It began with the arrival of the inquisitors in a specific locality. A period of grace was proclaimed for penitent heretics, after which time denunciations were accepted from anyone, even criminals and other heretics. Two informants, whose identity was unknown to the victim, were usually sufficient for a charge. The court then summoned the suspect, conducted an interrogation, and tried to obtain the confession that was necessary for conviction. In order to do this, assisting secular authorities frequently applied physical torture. This practice made use of such painful procedures as stretching of limbs on the rack, burning with live coals, squeezing of fingers and toes, or the vertical rack. As you can see, the Catholic Church had no reservations about forcing its will on people. It still believes it has the right to kill all who oppose it. This right is only limited in those countries ruled by secular authority. Do you understand now how important our American liberties are? Do you understand that those who came to America in the 1600s and 1700s did so to escape the unjust laws and persecutions of the Catholic Church? Soon our own rights fought for by the early founding fathers of this nation, will be set aside, and church and state will unite, and persecution will again be kindled against all who do not belong to the church-state government. The fifth point says that it would try to change set times and laws. What would be set times and laws to God? Why would God be so concerned over someone attempting to change them? If these were man-made laws, God would have no problem with them being changed. Man-made laws are constantly being changed. But there is a law that can never be changed. It is the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments of the Decalogue are God's laws, and they never change. They are as eternal as God Himself. They are God's character written out. To change them is to change God. How did the Catholic Church attempt to change them? Again, we go back into history and we find that the Catholic Church wanted to make the pagans comfortable in their acceptance of Christianity. As paganism was falling apart, Christianity was growing. The Bishop of Rome looked around and saw all these poor pagans without a leader. Constantine had accepted Christianity. Therefore, the Catholic Church invited the pagans to bring their idols and have them Christianized. Paganism survived in the form of ancient rites and customs, condoned and or accepted and transformed by the Church. An intimate and trustful worship of saints replaced the cult of the pagan gods and satisfied the congenial polytheism of simple minds. Statues of Isis and Horus were renamed for Mary and Jesus. The Roman Lupercalia and the feast of the purification of Isis became the feast of the Nativity. The Saturnalia were replaced by Christmas celebrations. The Floralia by Pentecost. An ancient pagan festival of the dead by All Saints' Day. The resurrection of Attis by the resurrection of Christ. Pagan altars were rededicated to Christian heroes. Incense, lights, flowers, processions, vestments, hymns, which had pleased the people in older pagan cults, were domesticated and cleansed in the ritual of the church. And the harsh slaughter of a living victim was sublimated in the spiritual sacrifice of the Mass. That quote comes from the Story of Civilization, number 4, The Age of Faith, from Durant. Do you remember Jesus stating that we should beware of wolves in sheep clothing? Well, Lupercalia was a very ancient, possibly pre-Roman pastoral festival, observed on February 13 through 15 to avert evil spirits and purify the city, releasing health and fertility. The name, Lupercalia, was believed in antiquity to evince some connection with the ancient Greek festival of the Arcadian Lycaea, from ancient Greek lukos. Lukos means wolf, or in Latin, lupus. Lupercus is the god of shepherds. His festival, celebrated on the anniversary of the founding of his temple on February 15, was called the Lupercalia. His priest wore goatskins. That information was taken from Wikipedia. So here you have a wolf guarding the sheep. How fitting that the Catholic Church has accepted this pagan ritual. The Catholic Church is the wolf in sheep's clothing, guarding and devouring the sheep of Jesus. Notice how the pagans had Isis depicted as wearing a lunar or solar disk around the head. Look at the Catholic Church and its depiction of the Mother Mary. Isis was also called the Queen of Heaven. The Catholic Church simply adopted the pagan form of worship and Christianized it. But there is nothing Christian about it. Paganism was not conquered by Christianity. Christianity was conquered by paganism. In Jeremiah 44:15 through 18, we see where the Israelites were sacrificing offerings to the Queen of Heaven. The Bible tells us that God destroyed them for this evil. He will destroy the Catholic Church and all who continue to partake of its idolatries. In the Ten Commandments, idol worship is strictly forbidden. Exodus 20:4-5 states that we are not to make or worship idols. If you walk into almost any Catholic church, you will find idolatry and idol worship. Only God is to have our worship. The next part of the Ten Commandments that the Catholic Church changed was the fourth commandment. It reads, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." How did the Catholic Church change it? By Christianizing the pagan first day worship of the sun god. They told the pagans that they could worship on Sunday as long as it was to the Son of God. How sly. Who gave them the authority to change God's day? The whole Easter celebration is pagan. Nowhere in all the New Testament are we to celebrate Easter. By 400 AD, the Sabbath was outlawed, and Sunday was held in strictest obedience as the Sabbath. The change was made by civil and religious orders. But nowhere in the Bible will you find the change sanctioned by God. The Lord's Day is still Saturday, the seventh day of the week. Jesus said he was Lord of the Sabbath. That hasn't changed in 6,000 years. Many Protestants have for years condemned the Catholic Church for all of its anti-Christian teachings and practices. Yet Protestants fail to understand that they practice and teach many, if not most, of the teachings that the Catholic Church adopted from paganism. Most of the Protestant churches today continue to keep the pagan first day, Sunday, as their Sabbath. Yet it is neither scriptural nor sanctioned by God. The Catholic Church makes it very plain in its writings that it changed the Sabbath because it has the authority to do so. It will tell you that there is no scriptural basis for the change. It will also tell you that if you keep Sunday as your holy day, you are honoring the Catholic Church and its power to change the Sabbath. You are not honoring God. The last point is the time that the Catholic Church would rule over the world. The Bible says it would rule for a time, times, and half a time. What does that mean? A concordance will tell you that a time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is half a year. If you add that up, you come to 3.5 years. Far too short a time to meet the historical accuracy for the rule of the Catholic Church. But 3.5 years is only true if you take time, times, and a half a time to be literal. But by reading Daniel chapter 7, it is obvious that we are not talking literal here. No literal beast, no literal lion with wings, No literal leopard with four wings, no literal horns. Since the prophecies of the book of Daniel are symbolic, so must the time element be symbolic. Since it is symbolic, we need biblical explanation to interpret it. Not a difficult task. The Bible is very plain. All we need to do is accept it. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel says to King Nebuchadnezzar, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come." In days to come. Well, we know already from our study of Daniel 2 that the dream the king had was not for days, but for years. Here we have a concept of days representing years. In Numbers 14:34, we are told, "For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you." Here it is very explicit that 1 day equals 1 year in prophecy. Ezekiel 4:5 and 6 says the same thing. "I have assigned you the same number of days as the years of their sin. So for 390 days you will bear the sin of the house of Israel. After you have finished this, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the house of Judah. I have assigned you 40 days, a day for each year." We now have biblical authority to change the symbolic time into real time. How? Like this. Time equals 1 year. Times equals 2 years. Half a time equals half a year. Based on the 30 days per month of the lunar calendars, 1 year would equal 360 days. The 365-day calendar year did not come into existence until the Romans, about 500 years after this prophecy was given to Daniel. The lunar year that Daniel went by contained 360 days. Let's expand our equation. Time equals 1 year equals 360 days. Times equals 2 years, 720 days. Half time equals half year, 180 days. Now we add up the number of days and it comes to 1,260 days. Sure, you say, but that still is 3.5 years. Symbolic time, yes, but not real time. In real literal time, we convert the 1,260 days to 1,260 years. Remember our biblical authority that a day equals a year? Now let's look at the Catholic Church and see if it matches the time the Bible said it would rule the world. Remember what we read? The Bishop of Rome could not take over complete control of the world's churches until the Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths were taken out of the way. In 538 AD, the last of the three, the Ostrogoths, were driven from Rome, and the bishop had complete control over the entire Christian world and its doctrines. Using the date 538 AD as our starting point, we traveled down through 1,260 years of papal rule. At the end of the 1,260 years, we come to 1798 AD. That is when the Catholic Church was no longer able to rule the world. So what happened in 1798? In 1796, a French army occupied the Papal States, and in 1798, Rome was occupied and declared a republic. Pope Pius was taken as a prisoner to France, where he died. This ended the long, persecuting reign from the Catholic Church. England, France, and Germany, along with many other nations, broke away from the controlling influences of the Catholic Church. It suffered a fatal blow. Does it remain forever a destroyed, powerless institution? Oh, we know from history that it rose again to power. Not the same secular controlling power, but to great political and spiritual power. Does the Bible predict that? Yes. You can learn of that in our Revelation video series. As you can see, the Bible has been perfect in all of its prophecies. Everything has come true. I can trust my God. He knows the future. In later studies, we will discuss prophecies that bring us right up to our day and beyond. Now, let's take a look at the relevance of these 6 points in our lives. The Catholic Church was rising among nations. Christians are to come out from all churches. It uproots 3. We are to be planted firmly in Christ. The Catholic Church speaks boastfully. Christians are to speak meekly and humbly. The Catholic Church wages war against the saints. Christians are to be peacemakers. The Catholic Church changes times and laws. Christians are to keep God's laws. The Catholic Church rules over others. Christians are to serve all. Thank you for joining me in this video. I look forward to sharing with you in my next video. God bless you as you live in obedience to the laws and teachings of Jesus.